Hello, humans. Here's part two of Desiring a Man She Cannot Have. In part one, we talked about Lady Han, who was written about, pre-Han Dynasty. She was written about in Shiji by Sima Chen, and Chung Yui treated her and said her amenorrhea and back pain was because she desired a man she could not have. After that, we saw Shu Shu Wei, no, Chu Cheng talked about how if a girl doesn't, get married and join with a man in quotes before she's, you know, 24 or something like that, that she's going to have certain problems. And then we saw Shu Shu Wei with a case of a Buddhist nun who, obviously shouldn't be sleeping with anyone. And he had a formula for that he called Di Huang Wan. And we saw some other people use this same formula. So it has Sheng Di Huang and it has Chai Hu in it, and it has Huang Qin in it. And Chai Hu and Huang Qin are two herbs in Cha Chai Hu Tang, which we'll see mentioned here. So, I'm moving forward in time, and now it's the Yuan dynasty. Although this is a Qing dynasty book that's talking about Zhu Danqi, who was a Yuan dynasty doctor. So even though this was written later, it's about an earlier case. This is from Gujin Yi An, but the case is in a lot of different places. We'll see two versions of it. So here is a new case with the same kind of idea that if somebody desires a man and isn't able to have him, a woman desires a man and isn't able to have him, that she'll develop certain types of illnesses. So here, after being recently married, a woman's husband went on a business trip and he hadn't returned 2 years later. I mean, travel was hard in the Yuan dynasty if you were going, on the Silk Roads, or if you were going on a ship somewhere. It could be a long time. So because of this, she got depressed and she did not eat and she lay sleepily in bed as if she were dull-witted. It's like she just had no urge to do anything, just lie there. And there was no other disease. She often sat facing the inside of the bed. So they eventually called Zhu Danxi to see her. He's one of the four great masters of the Jin Yuan dynasty. And he found that her liver pulse was wiry and went beyond the Zunquo. So in the part one of this, we learned that that's a special pulse when it goes up near lung 10. That's a special pulse that means that this person desires someone they can't have, and that's the cause of their ills. He said this is because she longs for the man she cannot have. So qi binds up in the spleen. Why spleen? Because I told you in the last version that this word that here is translated as longs is the same word that means thought, which is the emotion of the spleen. But if you look it up in a Chinese dictionary, it's not only thought, but it can mean longing, yearning, pining for something. And so because it's this same word that belongs to the spleen, then, Suen chapter 39 says thought binds chi. And it's going to bind chi of the spleen because it corresponds to the spleen. It resonates with the spleen. So here's a new concept. He says it's difficult to treat with herbs alone. We have this concept for various conditions that are caused by emotions. This phrase, it's difficult to treat with herbs alone, is used a lot in emotional conditions. So yeah, you can use herbs and you can make it somewhat better, but unless the emotions are able to change, then it's just going to come back. So I have other videos about using emotions to treat emotions and so forth. There are a lot of other videos about that. So you can look for that. Um, anyway, so he says it will resolve when she can achieve happiness. So we can take that on face value, and say that, this is the word joy, and joy is the emotion of the heart. So, heart is fire, fire is the mother of the spleen. Maybe that's it. Or just if she's happy, she won't be longing anymore. But this term, achieve happiness, is actually has another meaning, which means to become pregnant, because they thought for a woman to become pregnant was to achieve happiness. To some degree, it was. And, for some people today, it is achieving happiness. But anyway, so this has a double meaning. If she can be happy or if she can be pregnant or both things are happening at the same time, that will cure her problem. But if she can't achieve happiness because her husband's still gone, so she can't become pregnant and she can't hang out with him if she's just longing for his company. He says, second choice is to make her angry, because the spleen governs thought, or the spleen governs longing. And so when it's excessive, spleen chi binds up. And then she can't eat. She was just facing the wall and not eating and so forth. But anger belongs to the liver, wood, and wood controls earth. If you can make her angry, chi will move up and also move outward. And this surge will break open the bound up spleen chi. So, normally we think the control cycle causes problems, but here he wants to use the control cycle to break through something that's stuck. So, how did they achieve anger? Just a little, domestic abuse. Her father slapped her face and berated her. She howled and cried with rage. And after 3 hours, but back then they were double hours, so that's like 6 hours had passed, then they figured she'd cried herself out, and they consoled her, and they, gave her herbs, and they gave her rice porridge. And so Judah, she said, even though the chi of longing has temporarily resolved, she still has to achieve happiness. Otherwise, we're going to have the same thing all over again. So, like, to make matters worse, they then pretended that they had a letter from the husband saying that he will be home soon. But actually, they didn't know. However, fortunately, 3 months later, he did return and she recovered. So, that's how they treated women. You can slap them around, you can lie to them. Yeah. Okay. Um, the same story another Dr. Zheng Jibin told in the Ming Dynasty. It's a little bit different, so let's see how he tells it. After a girl was married, her husband was engaged in business, didn't return for 2 years, so she stopped eating, sleepy, lay in bed. She seemed to be feeble-minded, but there was nothing else wrong with her. She often sat facing the inside of the bed. This was longing that bound up her chi. This was thought that bound chi, because Suen 39 says thought binds chi. And again, he says it's difficult to treat just using medicine. You have to use emotions to treat emotions. Again, he says only achieving happiness could resolve it, otherwise make her angry. So the wood will move upward and outward and open up spleen chi, because wood can control earth. So Judan Shi, here it says Judan Shi slapped her around, not the father. Anyway, she became enraged and she cried for a long time. And then he gave her one packet of herbs. She asked for food. He told her he told them she still has to achieve happiness. So, when he returned, she lived happily ever after. I probably don't need this story twice, but anyway, we're going to move on to a Ming Dynasty doctor named Shuiji. But before I do, I want to mention one other thing. the original Xiaoyao San, really famous formula. It comes from Taiping Huimin Heji Zhufang, a Song Dynasty formula book. And in that book, some of the indications are irregular menstruation, malaria-like sensations of cold and heat, which we saw in the last, part one of this. And it says it treats weak blood or yin deficiency in unmarried girls. So the term for unmarried girls is actually a term that means like a house maiden, and is, sometimes people translate this as virgin. But just because somebody's unmarried doesn't necessarily mean they're a virgin, although they probably were back then. But it means a girl who is still living in her father's house and hasn't moved to her husband's house because she's not yet married. Okay. And so now we know that unmarried girls, obviously are not supposed to be having sex, and so they're also then manless women, and so they can also pine away longing for their future husband. And that's a thing. Some of these girls got like depressed and moody and stopped eating to the point where, at least if you can believe the stories, they died from their longing. That was a thing in the Ming Dynasty. So yeah, these would be 14 or above. Just imagine like a 14-year-old today who's not allowed to even date or something, and how frustrated teenagers get. So you can imagine there could be some problems that could arise if she wanted to be married already, but for whatever reason, it wasn't happening yet. Anyway, so we can add unmarried girls to this. So we're going to look at Shuiji's discussion from his one of his gynecology books or female medicine books. And the section is called Sensations of Cold and Heat in Nuns and Widows, which is, one of the symptoms we've been seeing in part one and in this part. Okay. So here is his discussion of it. Master Chu of the Song Dynasty treated nuns and widows by preparing different formulas and herbs than for married women. So in part one, we did go over what Master Chu said, and even though the received text doesn't have him saying this, but we also saw, who was it? Somebody quoted him, Shu Shu Wei, I think, quoted him as saying this. Okay. So Master Chu supposedly said solitary yin, meaning an unmarried woman, without yang, meaning a man, results in contentious interaction of yin and yang, of blood and qi. And so this contentious interaction makes alternating fever and chills. And perhaps there's back pain. That was one of the original symptoms of Lady Han in, the first telling of this condition, with sensations of cold and heat. The liver pulse is wiry and goes beyond the tsunko. This is the disease. So we've seen that long pulse, in most of these cases. When there are sensations of cold and heat in an unmarried girl whose wedding has fallen behind schedule, it's also like this. So yeah, now he's including unmarried girls. So then he makes his statement: when a male has plenty of jing, he thinks of the bedroom. When a female has plenty of blood, she wants to get pregnant. This is the principle of heaven and earth. Well, back then it was really, a woman's job to get pregnant, and she didn't have many other alternatives. And there was huge pressure to bear a son. So she was raised to want to have children, and there was a lot of pressure for that. So she probably wanted to, just so that her life would be easier if she had a son for her husband's family. Anyway, so that was Shuiji's discussion of this. And then he gives herbs. So he says, treat it using Xiao Chai Hu Tang, adding Sheng Di Huang. So remember, Sheng Di Huang was the main formula was called Di Huang Wan or Sheng Di Huang Wan. And then it did have Chai Hu and Huang Qin in it. So at least two of the main ingredients of Chai Hu Tang. If it's lasted a long time and blood is deficient, then add Su Tang. I'm assuming, these are pretty basic formulas, so I'm assuming you have an idea about it. If not, you can Google these formulas and easily find answers. If there's anger stirring up liver fire at the same time with sensations of fever and chills, assist with Jiaowei Xiaoyao San, because that has some cooling ingredients for liver fire. If the liver channel is enfeebled at the same time as these sensations of fever and chills, then assist with Bajian Tang, which supplements qi and blood. So, Shuiji he used a lot of the same formulas we use today, but some of his diagnoses are a little bit different than what we use today. We don't usually talk about the liver channel being deficient, but this just really means the liver organ, blood deficient. Mm. If the patient's original qi is deficient at the same time, then add Buzheng Tang. So original qi is a term that Li Dongyuan used. He's the author of Buzheng Tang. Buzheng Tang was a favorite of Shuiji, used it a lot. And then if constraint damages spleen qi at the same time as these sensations of fever and chills, use Gui Tang that came from Jishen which is a formula book. Okay, so that's just the Gui Tang that we know. But it's interesting. First off, this is the first time we see the word constraint associated with it, at least in the things I found. Although, Xiaoyao Song was mentioned for this kind of thing, and Xiaoyao Song is for liver qi constraint, although the original text did not use those terms. But now this isn't liver constraint. He's actually talking about spleen constraint. I've translated a bunch of Shuiji, and that was one of his things. Sometimes there was lung constraint, and sometimes there was spleen constraint. And that did not mean that liver was bothering the lungs or the spleen. That meant the spleen itself was bound up from thought, or the lungs were bound up from sorrow kind of stuff. So anyway, Gui Tang, of course, if it was liver constrained, Gui Tang wouldn't be appropriate, but for spleen, Gui Tang is okay. Anyway, so these are his modifications when there's a so-called manless woman who has, fever and chills and a wiry pulse that goes up to lung 10 region. He says that this pattern is often found when the timing of menstruation is irregular. So treat it according to the specifics and whether it's acute or chronic. So that makes sense. Treat what you see is what we always say, right? Okay. Then Shuiji has a few cases. He wrote lots of short cases. I think we have 3 of them, very short. So, due to anger, a widow ended up with these sensations of cold and heat at no particular time. They just come and go randomly. This went on for a long time without stopping. Her liver pulse was wiry and tight. I treated her with Xiao Chai Hu Tang, adding Sheng Di Huang, and she recovered. That's what he was saying to use for this kind of condition. However, she met with wind and then she got fever and chills again. This was spleen and stomach deficiency. Sounds weird, but if right qi is deficient, then it's easy for wind to invade. So I used 2 decoctions. I used Jiaowei Gui Tang and Buzheng Tang, for the spleen and stomach. She took them together and lived happily ever after. Here's a second of his cases. An unmarried girl, a girl who is still living in her parents' house, had sensations of cold and heat. Her left hand pulse was wiry and long, going beyond the tsunko, the classic pulse for this. I treated her with Xiao Chai Hu Tang, adding Shengdi Huang and Ume, which was, in the it was in one of the earlier formulas. Anyway, she recovered. Since she got married, she's lived happily ever after, like having a man fixed it, right? Right. And Shuiji's final case, a released palace maiden, was more than 30 years old. So, what is a released palace maiden? She's a woman who worked in the imperial palace, but eventually she was allowed to retire and leave the palace. But while she was there, she was not allowed to marry. So, she was a manless woman. Now she's more than 30 years old, which was kind of considered a little bit old. She wasn't going to have a good marriage after, you know, only becoming available when she's 30. So her problem, both hips were painful, although there's no change in the color of the flesh. So it wasn't like a bruise or anything. Her urination and bowel movements were painful. It was like she had a Lin pattern, the 5 Lin urinary dribbling and stuff like that. And also, it was difficult for her to get up after going to the bathroom because, they use squat toilets and her hips were painful. So it was hard for her to get back up. She suffered from blood stasis soaking into the tunnel pathways. Huh. So in the old books, sometimes they call the channels and vessels the channel tunnels, they use the word tunnel for the channels. And we saw in the thing in part one that Chu Chung warned that the blood would seep into the wrong places and become masses and so forth. This was a condition due to loss of joining of male and female. This was because she wasn't having sex, and it's difficult to treat. Later, the blood stasis burst open and would not close up. She suffered scrofula and died. Wow, that's kind of weird. So, scrofula is in modern times tuberculosis of the lymph nodes. Back then they knew consumption, but tuberculosis is a specific mycobacterium. And so anyway, this may or may not have been what we today would diagnose as tuberculosis that got into the lymph nodes. But in scrofula, eventually they can get so big and they can break open and ooze and plus, there's the tuberculosis to deal with. So anyway, she didn't have a happy life, did she? Poor thing. This woman, after she was 30 and she was released from the palace, she became a concubine of Mr. Tong from my hometown. Tong was frequently away on business, and so when she was inside the palace, like she must have had worry and constraint for a long time. But when she was released from the palace, she still couldn't do what she wanted because her husband was always away and left her behind. So she still was relatively manless. And it resulted in this disease. Okay. A couple more little things. We're almost done with this part. Here's another collection of case studies, Ming Yi Lei An, and it's was written by somebody named Zhang Guan, and his son Jiang Huangnan was also a doctor, and some of the cases in it are, this older Mr. Jiang's son. Here it is. So his son treated a widowed noblewoman. The timing of her menstrual period was irregular. She constantly suffered these sensations of cold and heat. Her hands and feet were sometimes numb. Furthermore, her heart was deficient with fright palpitations, and sometimes her heart felt spicy hot. Various treatments were ineffective. So the son, Miss Dr. Jiang, examined her. Her liver pulse was wiry and went beyond the left sunko. So he knew it was constraint and that she had unfulfilled desires of the heart. Okay, so we can see now that we've gotten to the Ming Dynasty, this condition has started to be associated with constraint, whether it's liver constraint, spleen constraint from longing. Liver also makes sense because of the wiry long pulse and so forth. But because the pulse, I'm sure this noble woman wasn't talking about how lonely she was since her husband died, because, she wasn't going to talk to an unrelated male like that. But because of the wiry pulse and the long pulse, he knew it was constraint and he speculated, since she was widowed, that it was because of unfulfilled desires of the heart. So he gave her a totally different formula, nothing like anything we've talked about, just two herbs, Uyao, which is a warming herb, and Xiangfu, which is, moving herb. And after two doses, she lived happily ever after. And so this book was written in the Ming Dynasty, and then different people commented on it later, and that commentary is included. So a commentator named Xu, said, when Jing and blood flourish in males and females, they have longing and desire. Okay, and when unmarried girls and widows long for someone they cannot have, qi binds up. And then when qi binds up, how can blood move? So it becomes blood stasis. When a male longs for a female that he can't get, his jing gets stuck. The theory is the same for males and females. Well, that's interesting. So this is the first time somebody's really said that there's a parallel thing in males as well. So back to the females, though. Menstrual blood has already left its proper position. It seeps into the tunnels, so it mutates into these sensations of cold and heat. Does that make sense? I'm not sure it does, but that's what he says. The liver pulse is wiry, going beyond the tsunko. Well, let's explain this. He says the kidneys govern closing and storing. Kidneys want to hold on and store things, while liver governs coursing and discharging, or in English, they often say the smooth flow of qi. Here, liver fire was not discharged and it counterflowed upward. So doctors knew it was a disease of loss of male and female joining, or so the doctor knew. Yeah. And then another person gives an annotation. When there's desire for a man, but inability to have one or have him, minister fire is constrained internally. So now we bring minister fire into this equation. And again, constraint, but it's not really liver constraint necessarily. Minister fire is constrained, like a burning ember in the lower jiao. Long-lasting constraint results in hidden consumption of qi and blood. Yin and yang interact contentiously, so there are these sensations of cold and heat, which is the inappropriate interaction of yin and yang. So the whole thing is not all from qi and blood leaving their positions. Remember, there was the idea that the blood would seep into the bones and make masses and so forth. And he says that might be part of it, but that's not all of it. Seeping into the tunnels and mutating into cold and heat. Many symptoms of loss of joining become consumption. We saw Shuiji had a case that became consumption and cannot be treated by herbal medicine. That idea that emotions need to be treated by emotions. The emotions have to be released. So the doctor, Mr. Zhang or Dr. Zhang, discussed the wiry liver pulse that went beyond the tsunko as a problem of liver governing the smooth flow of qi, the coursing and discharging. Here, liver fire didn't discharge, it counterflowed and moved upward. This theory makes sense, he says. Okay, this is our last slide for part two, but there is a part three that gets kind of creepy. Yeah, I saved the creepy stuff for last. Okay, so this is a famous book, The Golden Mirror, and it was a book that was commissioned by the emperor, the government, it's Qing dynasty, and a large part of it is poetry. You can see just by looking at this text that it has to be poetry because in Chinese, one character is one syllable, and you can already see this is rhythmic, seven, characters per line. And so this is menstrual block, meaning amenorrhea, in Taoist and Buddhist nuns, unmarried girls, and widows. And so, Taoist and Buddhist nuns, unmarried girls, and widows are treated differently than ordinary married women because they thought married women were ordinary and unmarried, manless women were unusual. So if the pulse is wiry and goes past the tsunko, we know her heart mind feels dissatisfied. If you regulate menstruation without knowing this, how can you understand the symptoms? How can you get it right if you don't understand this comes from her dissatisfaction? Harmonize her liver, rectify her spleen, open constrained chi, clear her heart mind, and follow the pattern to be effective. So, they're still telling you to do pattern diagnosis. It's not like just always give this same formula, but it gives you the idea of the direction it's going in. Okay. So now we've had two discussions and we're up to the Qing dynasty. And then the last part, as I've said, will be some creepy stuff that happens when these women without men are too lustful. Yeah, we'll see. So that's it for now. Okay, see you for part three pretty soon.